McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome. I'm Dennis McCuistion, and obviously we're joining you again via Zoom and online, and I'm delighted to have my co-host, Jim Falk, who's the CEO and President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. Jim, welcome back.
Always a pleasure to be here, and this couldn't be a more timely program. The year 2020 will always be linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, but it will also go down in history as a time when the relations between the United States and China spiraled downwards with wide-ranging implications for both of our countries. The unique status of democratic Taiwan, protected but really not guaranteed by the United States, has always been an irritant for Communist China. And over the last several months, the People's Republic of China has made its opposition more visible by stepping up its air and naval military presence over and around the island of Taiwan. And this, combined with the imposition of the National Security Act in Hong Kong, which happened in late June, as well as the handling of the pandemic, raise this question: is what has been accepted heretofore as the status quo at risk? And if so, what are the dangers? On July 23rd, the United States Senate passed with a vote of 86-14 its version of what is called the National Defense Authorization Act. And this included very, very strong language confirming the United States' commitment to strengthening Taiwan's military capability and, importantly, agreeing to joint military exercises. This bipartisan affirmation follows the House of Representatives' own version of the National Defense Act. This bill, which is expected to be approved, it will be signed by President Trump probably pretty soon. It is another symbol of the increasingly troubled U.S.-China relationship. So to delve deeper into these developments, Dennis and I are joined by a very good panel. First, we talked with Peter Chen. He's the Director General of the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Houston, where he represents the Republic of China's interest throughout the southern United States. We also talked with Dr. Cynthia Watson. She comes to us from the National War College, where she is Dean of Faculty and Academic Programs. Among her many areas of expertise and scholarship is the Asia-Pacific region. In particular, she focuses on U.S. national security. Gordon Chang, he's been on our program before, and he's a widely recognized political commentator and China analyst. He spent a large time of his career practicing law in Hong Kong and Shanghai. He's the author of The Great U.S.-China Tech War, and you've probably seen him frequently on Fox News, where he's a contributor. Ambassador Stapleton Roy, he was a prior guest on the program. He was a key player in 1978, working closely with Henry Kissinger during those secret negotiations, which led to the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Today, he's the founding director emeritus and a distinguished scholar at the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Your president, President Tsai, was recently reelected in January of 2020 with quite a victory. Yes. Her opponent was someone who proposed closer relationships with the People's Republic of China. So is that a trend that you're seeing, that there's really less interest among the people, your citizens, for a closer relationship?
I think, just as I mentioned, according to the statistics, more than 85% of people, they support maintain the status quo. So I think that's how it shows in the election as well.
So I was in Taiwan a little over a year ago, and when you would talk with government officials, they would say the policy is to maintain the status quo. So tell us again what the status quo is and what might destabilize that.
The problem is that the military balance across that 100 miles has changed pretty dramatically in the last 34 years.
So I think it's always helpful when we talk about something as complex as Taiwan to get a bit of historical reference. Tell us about the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, because that changed so dramatically, of course, the relationship.
Well, it wasn't actually the Taiwan Relations Act, Jim, that changed things. It was President Carter's decision in late 1978 to shift diplomatic relations from Taiwan, which was the Republic of China, and that was our diplomatic partner from 1949 to 1979. At that point, President Carter actually said, no, our diplomatic relationship is going to be with Beijing and the People's Republic of China. He did that against the wishes of many people in the United States. But what he was doing, and this has to be remembered, was putting the United States in much more of a consistent line with most of the countries of the world. Taiwan, even by the late 1970s, didn't have very many diplomatic relationships because Beijing doesn't allow you to have a diplomatic tie with both states. So the Taiwan Relations Act was passed by Congress in conjunction with President Carter, and that often gets forgotten, in order to give the United States a longer term tie with Taiwan, but recognizing that it is not a formal diplomatic tie. Taiwan has an office here in the National Capital Region called the Taiwan Economic and Cultural Relations Office. It is not an embassy, although they call the man who heads it their ambassador. But Taiwan also then has what we would call consulates across the United States. But what's so important about this particular law, and it is a US law, is it says that the United States will sell articles of a defensive nature to Taiwan should we deem it necessary for Taiwan's defense. That absolutely infuriates Beijing. It infuriates them. You never have a conversation in China that this doesn't come up, because China does not believe that the United States should interfere in what they consider to be their domestic political affairs. But the Carter administration needed this in order to move forward after they re-established relations with Beijing. So it put us into this rather complicated set of affairs with the island of Taiwan.
And I might add as well that in Texas, there's an office in Houston.
Yes, that's
which
correct.
Acts almost as a consulate, but clearly
Absolutely.
It's not. It's the Economic and Cultural Office, and it's run by a Director General. And I've been in many meetings where the Consul General of the People's Republic of China has gone and talked to, say, the mayor of Houston or the mayor of Dallas and said, please do something about the sale of F-16s, not understanding that clearly the mayor of Dallas is not going to be able to do anything about that.
Right. Yeah. Well, when you live in an authoritarian state, you figure that everybody acts the way you want them to.
How did this island of Taiwan come about in the first place? So give us just a skosh of history there about how it came about.
Taiwan is about 100 miles off the Chinese coast. It is populated by people demographically who actually came up from Southeast Asia, not from China itself originally. The Aborigines were from Southeast Asia. But there was a Chinese diaspora beginning as trade spread through Asia with the coming of the Islamic traders in the 12th, 13th, 14th century. And a population from Southeast China came to Taiwan. And the island was really not part of China per se until about the mid 17th century. Now, if a Chinese were sitting here, they would absolutely dispute that and say, in the way that they love to say, that that's not true, that everything has happened in perpetuity. But the truth is, it's really in the 1660s that the regime in China is able to subdue Taiwan, and it is basically a vassal state within the Chinese system. But what's important for your viewers to understand is as China talks about US interference with Taiwan since the Civil War ended in 1949, the truth is that the Japanese owned Taiwan from 1895 until the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, there was a civil war that lasted for 4 years until the communists defeated the nationalist regime, which fled to Taiwan and established the Republic of China on Taiwan in 1949. So this idea that it has always been totally part of China is a lovely fiction, but I have to say, I've never met a single person on the mainland that acquiesces to the suggestion that Taiwan is anything other than absolutely part of China.
The president of Taiwan is a woman. President
It is now, yes.
And re-elected in January overwhelmingly. And part
Correct.
of her platform, if I'm correct, was really independence.
Her party, the Democratic Progressive Party, has historically had a platform including independence. No Taiwanese president has actually said that. I should also note, as a historical curiosity, Beijing refers to it as the Taiwan Authority. They do not believe she is a president because she's, in their eyes, not president of a sovereign state. And the United States talks about her as president, but since we don't have diplomatic relations, we are also somewhat careful with our language. But what the DPP has talked about is trying to thread that needle very carefully, because Beijing has said if any president in Taiwan were to declare independence, that would lead to an act of war. And I am quite confident that Beijing is very serious about that.
Now, Taiwan is a major arms importer, not just from the United States, but from other places across the world.
Well, they're not actually, Jim, because a lot of the rest of the world has found out that if you import arms into Taiwan, if you export arms to Taiwan, Beijing will take reactive measures against you.
But I saw that they were the 9th largest recipient of arms. Is that not correct?
They buy as many arms as they can, but the United States is overwhelmingly their major arms supplier.
Okay. So essentially, how long could they last against the art? They couldn't. I mean, it'd be over in a blink of an eye, wouldn't it?
That is an extremely painful conversation for many people, because the balance of a growing prowess on the part of the PLA in all of its different forms, but especially the People's Liberation Army Navy, has certainly changed that balance of power. But the other thing that's happened is Taiwan has increasingly spent less and less on its own defense relative to its economic condition, and they've gone to an all-volunteer force. An all-volunteer force in a society that has seen a lot of prosperity does not always work. For the United States, it worked in the 1970s, but for Taiwan, it has not worked very well, and they have some really severe problems in terms of getting adequate people into their forces.
Well, Jim has had these conversations with a lot of people from Taiwan about, sort of the 800-pound gorilla idea in the room, and that is, if and when China makes a play for Taiwan on a more formal basis, from a military standpoint in particular, what is or what should be the U.S. government's response?
I believe that the U.S. response will be completely conditioned on how that problem emerges. And what I mean by that is, again, contrary to what a lot of people say, the TRA does not require us to defend Taiwan. It requires us to—
the Taiwan Relations Act.
The Taiwan Relations Act. It goes by that term, the TRA. It requires us to sell arms of a defensive nature when we believe it's right to do so. What is less clear, and this is where the strategic ambiguity comes from that I mentioned a minute ago, is whether the United States would then actively defend Taiwan. One of the greatest hopes in Taiwan is that the United States would defend the island, and then US allies, especially Japan, with whom Taiwan has a long history and it's a very interesting history, but also the Australians, potentially the South Koreans, that they would come to Taiwan's defense. I don't think there's any evidence of that, because those states are very worried about repercussions in their relationship with China.
Well, we've recently seen
relations that we talked about before from Beijing and Hong Kong obviously are in a state of disrepair right now, given the recent national security law.
Right.
How does that affect the relationship between Beijing and Taiwan, and how does it affect people's, let's say, perception of that relationship?
Well, the relationship between Beijing and Taiwan was much better between 2008 and 2009 and 2017, when the Nationalist Party president was in power, because he tried to open up some ties between the two states, primarily better economic ties, but also the ability for citizens on the mainland or on the island to go across the strait to the other side. As soon as Tsai Ing-wen took power in the spring of 2017, Beijing dramatically cut back on those enhanced ties because her party has the position Jim mentioned of having a plank in their platform that talks about independence. She has been very measured, in fact, in not invoking that independence, and she has had to quash down some of the elements within her own coalition who would like to more aggressively go for independence. But she has not been willing to go that far. And it means that as the concerns in Hong Kong grow, I believe that part of Beijing's reason for taking such a sharp move with the national security law is to try to signal to Taiwan, as she begins her second term, that Beijing will not tolerate Tsai Ing-wen changing towards an overt pro-independence position.
But before you go, I'd like to ask you about COVID-19, because Taiwan has received a lot of praise about how they handled the virus. And in fact, the Director General was in Dallas just a few weeks ago to give Parkland Hospital, our major public hospital, thousands of masks. How has Taiwan been able to play this to their advantage, and has it had any wider impact?
Taiwan's activities as a result of COVID show the frustration and the strength of the island. The frustration results from the fact that they have tried to capitalize on what has been a very successful policy in order to argue to the World Health Organization and to other multinational institutions that Taiwan should have a seat. Beijing has thrown them out of, or has facilitated Taiwan being thrown out of, international organizations for now the last 40 plus years, but actually almost 50 years. But so that this frustration on Taiwan's part, as they wanted to say, but see, we actually have something we can share with the international community, is completely understandable. On the positive side, this is a nation that was hit very hard by SARS back in 2003. They learned lessons. They put those lessons to use. They took the steps that were aggressively needed at the time, even though this is a thriving, what I like to call hyper-democracy, where they have incredible freedoms of the press, freedoms of assembly, but they took what they saw as a national step to try to address the virus as soon as it became clear that it was a major pandemic, and they have been relatively successful. I should add that they do have an advantage over a lot of other states, however, and that is their isolation geographically, as well as a lesser willingness on a part of a lot of countries to be as heavily engaged with Taiwan as they might be, has meant that they didn't get some of the cross fertilization of, to mix metaphors, cross-fertilization of the illness that has affected the United States and parts of Europe.
And I did notice when I was there that everyone wore a mask.
And people don't
Very
have a
common.
problem
It's part
wearing
of the
a mask.
culture.
Yes, that's right.
So we're just a few months out from the presidential election. Any daylight between the Republican and Democratic parties on this issue?
Actually, on the Taiwan issue, not really. There's a growing feeling, I think, in many quarters that perhaps the strategic ambiguity should be revisited in light of Beijing's aggressive behavior towards Hong Kong and other places. But I should also just remind everyone that Nancy Pelosi, whatever one thinks of her, represents Chinatown in San Francisco, which is an area that has many Taiwanese immigrants and many people who suffered under Beijing's rule historically. Though she has never been a friend to Beijing. And back in the old days, one might be surprised to find out Nancy Pelosi was very close to Jesse Helms' view, the late senator from North Carolina who didn't think there was anything China could do right. Nancy Pelosi and Helms had a lot in common on the China issue. There are still people talking about the need for the United States to remain engaged with China, but I think that those numbers are showing far more skepticism than they showed in the past. And there is a growing recognition that the idea that China would automatically look like the United States after a couple of decades of economic growth, I don't think anybody sees it that way anymore.
How do you see the Taiwan situation today?
Taiwan is moving further and further away from China as they look at Hong Kong. This one country, two systems formula was originally devised for Taiwan, not Hong Kong, but it was implemented first in Hong Kong and then in Macau. And people in Taiwan look at this and say, this is exactly what we do not want. They don't trust China. China has violated its promise to Hong Kong, so people in Taiwan know it will violate its promise to Taiwan itself. We had a very visible demonstration of this at the beginning of the year. President Tsai Ing-wen of the Democratic Progressive Party wasn't even going to get the nomination of her party last year for a second term. But the demonstration started in Hong Kong over the extradition bill. People in Taiwan got another look at what China really intends. And Tsai Ing-wen, she not only got the nomination of her party, she went on to win the second term by a landslide. And that's a real indication that Taiwan is moving in a direction that Beijing doesn't want. But Beijing can't complain because it is China's own actions that are forcing Taiwan to be much more independent and to move in a direction that Chinese leaders just abhor. Well, Taiwan is critical to the United States, far more important than most Americans realize, for two reasons. First of all, for more than a century, America has drawn its Western defense perimeter, not off the coast of Hawaii or even Guam, but off the coast of East Asia. And Taiwan sits at the center of that perimeter where the South China and East China seas meet. So for us, it is, as a Navy admiral once said, the cork in the bottle. It keeps China's Air Force and Navy confined to its peripheral waters. But there's an even more important reason, and that is that China's attacking our democracy. It attacks even the concept of democracy. We can't allow China to absorb any democracy, especially one as important as Taiwan. So defending Taiwan is defending America.
So what is the status quo?
It's broadly speaking, is how we deal with the other. And I think most importantly is like both sides have to approach cross-strait exchange with a positive attitude, insist on parity and dignity, also based on interaction on democracy. And first of all, I think China must face the reality of the existence of the Republic of China, Taiwan.
There's nothing automatic about developing economies and engaging in free trade that makes you a democratic country. But think of it this way. Every successful country in the world today has a democratic system and a market economy. So all of the models that countries that want to become successful can see are countries that have representative, legitimate types of governments. So why should we be pessimistic that if China becomes embedded in this sort of a world and is able to raise the living standards of its people, that it won't change in the same way? But let's not make the mistake of proving that grass doesn't grow. How do you prove the grass doesn't grow? It's easy. You sit and watch it for several hours and you see nothing happening, and so you prove that it doesn't grow. But it does grow. You can prove that trade and economic development don't produce political change by simply taking a time frame so short that it's irrelevant to the types of changes that take place. That's why I mentioned that in Korea, in Taiwan, and Thailand, it took decades of economic growth before the political changes began to emerge. Same thing in Indonesia, over 3 decades of rapid economic growth, and then suddenly you have a democratic transition away from an authoritarian country. How long will it take in China? There's no formula, but we ought to be optimistic about it.
Dennis and I invite you to follow us on LinkedIn, and if by chance you've missed one of our programs, you can go to McCuistionTV.com or YouTube, where we have a channel. And again, thank you so much for joining us as we bring perspectives on things that matter with people like you who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email Nikki N at nikkimcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.